Great. So while I wait, welcome everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Dick, for inviting me. And so I want to pick up on where you left off with, have we got this? That is the question. So where are my slides? Do I have to push or will you? There we go. So adaptation has been a bit of a stepchild of US policy. And if you thought mitigation was the embrace child, you can get a hint of where that's going. So where I want to quickly start is, in case you were not at the first symposium, basically the key messages from that particular event. The upshot that I heard listening in was that we're expecting huge impacts from climate change that will affect every single sector, and I want to add to this, every single square centimeter of this country, of the world. Human migration security risk, you just heard. The costs are going to be extremely high. I think maybe higher than Max would let us believe. As you heard, they're very much limited by what they can measure. Uncertainties are not a reason to act, but instead are not a reason uncertainty is a reason to act, not to wait. And there are interactions between climate and all kinds of other stressors that we were seeing going on. All of this needs to be looked at through the lens of climate justice. So that was the 30-second summary of what happened in the first symposium. I want to give you a few snapshots of ways to think about this question, have we got this? Very quickly. When I was born, make this very personal, there was not any talk about adaptation. When I went to graduate school 20-some years ago, there were about 6 of us in this country thinking about this. This is what you see now in terms of just the publications out there in the scientific community on adaptation. In other words, in the last 10 years is when we have started to really dig into whether, what does this mean? How does this work? Who is vulnerable? What do we do about it? We're trying to learn faster. These are international conferences that are happening. The latest one in India is being planned right now. One of them was in the US. At the time, it was mostly scientists talking to themselves. And so in the shadow of that, we actually have another set of conferences emerging, which is a set of conferences where the practitioners go, the city planners, the engineers, the consultants, the NGOs, right? The next one in 21 is coming up. So we're beginning to learn from each other, but they're quite separate in terms of the science on the one hand and the practitioners on the other. We actually have regional adaptation conferences. You can see Massachusetts has its own. This morning I gave a keynote address at the Massachusetts Ecological Climate Action Network. But there are regional ones all around. It is, and I'm going to say more about that in a moment, it's a field that is professionalizing. People are beginning to know what they're talking about, which is a great thing. These are 2 different professional societies focused on climate action. The industry is coming. I don't know, many of you might have seen this, the Global Risk Report last year and the year before and the year before that. I think every year since 2013 said the failure of climate mitigation and adaptation is one of the top 3 risks to industry. States are beginning to wake up to this. In the absence of the Trump administration providing any leadership in Florida, we had a change in leadership there, and finally people can say the word sea level rise. 10 years late, they're regretting that they couldn't do this sooner. And just last week, I don't know, some of you might have seen this in the papers, New York Times, the bank regulators are getting really, really worried that we're not doing more on climate adaptation. It's a really big deal because this is affecting whether or not communities can borrow the money to invest in adaptation. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper in this question, what does it actually look like on the ground, in city governments, in organizations, in businesses? Do people have the capacity to adapt in the United States? I was asked with a couple of other colleagues of mine to do a field assessment. In 2017, just as the Trump administration came in, this is the report. You can find it easily online, Rising to the Challenge Together. If you don't have much time, there is an executive summary, and if you want to know what you can do, meaning whether you're in academia, whether you're in city, whether you're in an NGO, or wherever you might be, there's an appendix for you that specifically says, here's how you can help. What did we find? Maybe the most important piece is this. If we do not address this together across all these different sectors, I'm really worried that we're not going to meet the challenge that we have. Here is how we try to assess the state of the field. We took the literature on what do we know about field building and put it together in this very simple, memorable framework of the 4 Ps. Do we have the purpose? Do we have a shared purpose of what we're working toward? Do we have the right people doing it? Do we know what we're doing? What are the practices? And do we have the pillars of support, both the finances and the policy? And we then went basically through interviews and surveys and whatnot, looking at what is happening in the United States. What I'm going to give you is just a very, very short way of summarizing this. On the purpose, the most surprising thing maybe is that if you ask 87 people, as we did in our interviews, why are you doing this? You get 87 or 90 or 140 answers. You don't get a unified, here's why we're doing this and what we're trying to achieve. Most of them have come into the field very reactively because of Sandy, because of Katrina, because of whatever floods were happening somewhere or the wildfires somewhere. There is no agreement on the importance of social equity. Yes, people say that's, that's where the most vulnerable is, but people don't agree. That's not where the investment is going. There's no agreement on priorities in sectors or in regions, and maybe the most surprising, there's a surprising lack of a sense of urgency was missing. People were just like, yeah, we got time. Really? To get a seawall, it takes 20 years from the moment you decide you want one to actually have it sitting on your shores. 20 years to get the permits, to get the planning done, to get the environmental impact assessments done, and so on and so forth. We have no time to lose. How about the people? That was one of the better places of the 4 Ps. We saw a strong growth of numbers of people coming into the adaptation arena. Every one of these adaptation fora that I showed you earlier, there's probably 2/3 of the people who had never been to a previous one. In other words, there's new people coming into the field. The networking is good for some, for example, for urban communities, really bad for people in rural areas. The smaller cities left behind, as well as the rural areas and tribes. Tensions between how much should we embrace the diversity of the population versus actually make a network work. Any of you who know how easy or hard it is to work in very diverse networks, you know what I'm talking about. The loss of federal leadership and some of the very well-established resilience leaders in the federal government actually has hurt. What's interesting is the climate justice movement that has been growing in the sort of margins. Many of you might be interested and maybe part of that. They've been truly interesting in pushing for more emphasis on social equity and on a broader, deeper thinking in adaptation. But that is quite on the margins yet. It's not a widespread thing. What about practice? Well, I'll give you one example just to give you an illustration. In any area I have worked, people tell me, we got to build the tools, we got to build the tools. There are 10,000 tools to assess the feasibility or quality or figure out how to do green infrastructure, the latest buzzword in adaptation. 10,000 tools. Which one would you like to use for adaptation? Nobody knows, right? So we're investing in figuring this out, reinventing the wheel 1,000 times over, but we have not agreed on what is the best practice, what's the best tool to use. Most of people make very, very small incremental progress. And I want to show you on this particular picture here, it basically puts adaptation along a spectrum from the most superficial, let's just deal with the disaster of the day, all the way to addressing the deep causes of vulnerability and why things are happening to certain people. And what we found is that most people are investing in building adaptive capacity and essentially just managing, mainstreaming climate change into what they do without questioning what they do. It's just like, give me the right data and I'll use those, right? Very little is happening on thinking much more deeply. How is it that we need to redesign cities, redesign infrastructure? How do we make sure that the poorest are not always on the short end of the stick? In terms of the pillars of support, climate funding, climate adaptation funding is essentially crisis-driven. When a Sandy happens, all of a sudden you get billions of funds available for cities to all of a sudden come up with ideas of what to do, and they just basically do what they didn't have the funds for prior to the disaster. There is not a lot of proactive thinking and investment. You don't see a lot of leadership, certainly not anymore from the federal government. The states are stepping somewhat into that gaping hole. But when you don't have leaders that say resilience is important, adaptation is important, climate mitigation is important, well, then it must not be important, right? That's kind of how it happens. So what we found is because of that vast gap, and I've asked the question 100 times since we published this report, where do you think we are right now compared to 2017? The pillars of support are still the weakest bit, and it holds back the development of the field the strongest. So very quickly, I want to put up 4 things that I call worrying trends. One is, the first picture that came up here, is that I think we are in the process of doing handcraft. Little things, adjusting things there, turning the knobs there. We're not really deeply thinking about what are the challenges that are coming and how do we prepare for that. A lot of greenwashing is happening. We're mostly behind the 8 ball, basically just responding to things after the fact. And I want to just, I had to put a picture of men. Excuse me for saying that, but there is a gender dimension to this. Until very recently, the adaptation field in the US was dominated by women. In the planning, in the sustainability directors network, you name it, mostly women. Now we got the lawyers, the engineers, and the bankers. And who is that? Mostly men. It will change the conversation, and I think we are at a risk of losing what we have gained in making relationships and putting equity central to the conversation. I want to leave you with a sort of pledge or a call to MIT to think about what is the role of this institution in this conversation. I've looked at what universities are offering on adaptation. What we found is that most of them never mention the word adaptation in any easily findable way on their websites. It is not there. The second category is where you have to dig down, and somewhere in there is a climate class, there is a climate policy class, and in one of the lessons along the way, you hear about adaptation. You can barely find it on their websites. There is a very small number, and MIT is not among them, that basically has an adaptation certificate, a focused area on adaptation. So when we did our field assessment, we heard from many practitioners saying, I have all these high school students who come to me and say, how can I get into this field and do what you do? They have no way of finding it. It's not there. You cannot find it on a website, and MIT is not among them. So I want to urge you, and this is just an example of that. I looked at the plan for action on climate change for this institution. The word adaptation is mentioned 7 times in an 18-page document, and it basically has no specificity. There's nothing there compared to what is there for science or for mitigation. I want to say focus and build on the legacy of some of your great frontrunners. I want to dedicate this talk to my friend Joan Carmen, who passed away a few years ago. She was a world-renowned leader on urban adaptation, and I think you have your own very big shoes to fill. Make it, as the former chair of the faculty, Susan Silby, said, make it a part of your DNA. This is what you and what the future is all about, and we need people who are this smart to make a difference. Thank you.
Shall I go up?
Thank you, and that's the good news from a rich country.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon. Suzanne, you left us thinking hard, so it's great to be here. My name's Andrew Steer. I'm the president and CEO of the World Resources Institute. If there are any students here, we have a fabulous internship program, and now that MIT is clearly going to start a course on adaptation, maybe you take that, then you come and join our internship program, and we can send you to our offices in China or Indonesia or anywhere else for the summer, and we would love to have you. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you, Dick, for organizing this. This is really worthwhile. Let's get serious about climate change adaptation as if our lives depended upon it, and they just might. Realistically, in this country, most of our lives don't depend on it, but in developing countries, a lot more lives do. If you think about sort of the 5 physical things that climate change does, individually they're bad, but when they operate together, they can be a really poisonous cocktail for poor people around the world. First, warmer temperatures. Second, rising seas. And remember, seas rise because water gets expanded when it's warmer. Plus, you have melting, obviously. Stronger storms, shifting rainfall, which can give you more water or less water. And finally, acidification of the ocean, which doesn't affect you and me directly, but affects hundreds of millions of people in areas close, for example, to coral reefs. All of these things affect poor people and poor countries much more than they affect us, in part because adaptation is easier when you have a lot of money. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is the effect on the rest of the world that those of us in this room who on average are emitting probably 22 tons of carbon per person, that's 20 trips in that car that Max was talking about across the United States. Some of us a lot more because we fly a lot more. So we're emitting that much, and the average person in Africa emits about 1 ton per hectare, about 1 ton per person. And by 2050, we'll all be able to emit maximum of 1 or 2, 1.5 tons. So we've got a long way to go. The cost to people and economy, the World Bank estimates 100 million people may fall into poverty as a result of climate change. Agricultural yields, huge uncertainty, as was told us earlier in the first session, but up to 30% in countries where, quite frankly, it's already very difficult for farmers to eke out a living. Currently, about 3.5 billion people suffer from a water shortage at some stage during the year. That will be up to 5 billion. That's estimates that we do at the World Resource Institute. And more than $1 trillion per year in cost to coastal cities. So this is serious. And I think the way Suzanne put it was really terrific, actually. Huge sort of energy in the last 10 years, growing and growing. There's a professional cadre out there that's doing lots and lots of interesting, usually small research. It's not yet adding up. The politicians haven't yet got it. And so, for example, if you look at sort of the total amount of money that goes into climate change internationally, only about 10% goes to adaptation, 90% to mitigation. And one of the reasons for that, actually, is those of us in the environmental community have been saying, no, don't do it in adaptation, because that will give the impression that we can handle climate change. We must stop climate change. And of course, the amounts of money we put into climate change overall are so trivial, we easily could pay for both. So again, even within developing countries, this is a picture of Mumbai. The blue are the low income, close to the river. The green are not high income, but certainly higher income, stronger houses, more green, higher up, safer. Who has the political power? Those in those areas on the right-hand side. So is much being done about climate change adaptation? Not very much. Interesting difference here in the United States, where it tends to be the rich people that live near the water. Boston has a fabulous, amazing plan for adaptation. I'm sure you're aware of it. And in fact, many of those that, maybe some in this room, have beautiful homes close to the water, they will be protected. And so, if you like, the politics will influence what happens. About a year ago, we, together with the Dutch government, came to the conclusion that there's so much going on out there, it's not adding up. Wonderful handicrafts, you called it. It's a wonderful image, if you like. We need to raise the political temperature. So we asked Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, and Kristalina Georgieva. Kristalina Georgieva was the CEO of the World Bank. She's just taken over as the head of the IMF. So it's pretty cool that you have the head of the IMF now chairing the Global Commission on Adaptation. Bill Gates doesn't join commissions as a matter of principle, But this time he said, look, I've put billions of dollars into agriculture in Africa, trying to relieve poverty, improve food security, improve health. It's all threatened. It's very serious. So we also asked 20 convening countries at the head of state level, and we were surprised and delighted that these are heads of state in China, India, and you see the countries, a lot of African countries, small island countries, European countries, the UK. The Netherlands has led this effort diplomatically. And so we just brought out a report last month in time for the Climate Summit that basically tried to distill what it would take to move from the current situation, where clearly we need to act, to a situation where we will act and politicians will really take this seriously. Because up till now, quite frankly, it's much more exciting to open a beautiful solar plant than it is to do something that actually doesn't seem to do anything except stop bad things happening 20 years from now. And so changing that politics. So we start by making the fairly obvious point that adaptation is a moral imperative at several levels. The poor didn't cause the problem, but they pay the highest price. That's true within countries. It's also true across countries. There's also a moral issue in terms of time. It will be tomorrow's generation that pays the price. It's our generation that caused the problem. So it's a moral imperative. It's a human imperative, obviously, because there is such incredible human costs that are being borne at the moment and will more in the future. It's an ecological imperative because climate change is threatening the ecology, and unless we figure out how to adapt, we will be in deep trouble. And it's a massive economic imperative. A country like India, for example, is estimated simply through the medium of water to have GDP 6 percentage points lower than it would be otherwise without climate change. So as Suzanne was sort of implying, we actually need almost a sort of psychological shift, the way we think about things. We suggest 3 revolutions. The first is in understanding, in science, in data, but how that is communicated. Even here in the United States, most mayors of cities, most CEOs of corporations, and even the federal government doesn't necessarily get the best data in the most user-friendly, decision-friendly sort of way. And if it's not true here in the United States, it's absolutely not true in places that we work in, for example. I was out 2 months ago to meet with the finance ministers of the 14 Pacific Island states, and it was in Fiji. And there you say, so where's your Ministry of Climate Change? And they say, well, it's in the Ministry of Finance, of course. Well, why would you put it in the Ministry of Finance? Because finance doesn't make any sense unless we think about the risks of climate change. And we have to devote all our time to getting the right data in the right place so we can make the best possible decisions. And it's, with the right decision at the right time, you can have amazing impact. This is roughly the same intensity of a hurricane or typhoon in Bangladesh. And you see back in 1970, I mean, an incredible tragedy. 300,000 people lose their lives because now information systems, the so-called last mile, plus schools have 2 stories rather than 1 so that you can avoid the floods and so on. And now look at how the amazing reduction in lives lost. I mean, incredible. So information with simple investment can save lives. So first we need a revolution in understanding, getting the right data to the right people at the right time. Second, we need a revolution in planning and decision-making, as Suzanne was implying. For the last 100 years, since we've had so-called sort of modern planning, we have believed that the past trends are a good way of thinking about the future. The way you plan for the future is by looking at past trends, and that probably was true at one stage. It's no longer. The future now is actually unknowable, so we're moving from straight lines and smooth curves to jagged edges and unpredictability. That has a pretty profound impact on the way we do our planning. And if you are a Minister of Finance or a Minister of Planning or a Minister of almost anything in a government, you've got to think rather differently about things. Consider this, for example. I don't expect you to be able to read it, but this looks across, in the vertical, it's what's the temperature increases. And the answer is, of course, we don't know what it'll be. So that adds another degree of uncertainty, because we don't even know what we should be planning for. But according to whether it's a 1.5 degrees Celsius, look at agriculture, the first one, that will lead to a 6% decline in the global average maize crop yield. But if it's 2 degrees, you have all kinds of other impacts. And that's just agriculture and the natural environment. 1.5 degrees will leave, what the IPCC tells us, that we'll lose 70 to 90% of coral reefs, just 1.5. And you imagine what is higher. So if you are a planner, so to speak, you have to sort of, in a way, have this on your wall and try and figure out, okay, how am I going to raise revenues, allocate revenues, put policies in place, persuade the Ministry of Infrastructure to do things differently, to strengthen the whatever infrastructure they're building, so you can start seeing how, if you're a low-income country, this is quite a challenge. And so we need a pretty radical change in the way we plan. And finally, we need a revolution in the way we do our finance and investment. I already mentioned the example of the Fijian Minister of Finance, who spends his time thinking, a great deal about how will I create a tax that will enable me to have enough revenue to move 10 villages that I have to move today, and I'm moving hospitals as well. And to what extent should I do things like that? Or to what extent should I buy into insurance systems where we pool the risk across all of the Pacific Islands so we can share risks? And what happens when, for example, which is a true story that they discussed with me, they said, we have enough money to bring electricity to all our citizens now. We have a plan. The problem is we were assuming that we would take the electricity above ground. And now with our new meteorological advice, we're told that if we have it above ground, you will guarantee that every 5 years it will be destroyed. So we have to put it under the ground, which doubles the price. So which members of the community should we not bring electricity to? And that gets you into thinking about the role of international players and the role of international finance and official development assistance. And it's wonderful now we have a Green Climate Fund whose job precisely is to bring green money, green subsidized grant money, and where it says blended finance at the bottom. What that means essentially is, look, most of adaptation will be paid for by poor people, by poor farmers, by poor countries. But there is a role in which grant finance internationally can come in to make it possible. Sometimes you'll have to subsidize certain things. Sometimes you'll have to outright finance them. Sometimes you'll be able to give subsidized interest rates and so on. So and so too stress tests. One of the problems that we've had for adaptation is there's no way of measuring how resilient a sector or a city or a country is. And so we need to think about how do we measure resilience? When it comes to mitigation, it's pretty easy because we've got a ton of carbon. Now, the social cost of carbon is hard to estimate, but everyone can get their head around the fact there's a ton of carbon, and driving from here to California, will lead to certain damage. When it comes to adaptation or resilience, we don't really have a very good measure. So one of the things that we're working out in this commission is, how do we create stress tests so that we can actually be able to say, yes, actually doing this will make us more resilient to the following extent. So I think that is the end, and I have 14 seconds left. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Let me ask the audience a question. How many people know that Boston has a plan for dealing with sea level rise?
Yeah,
How many people think it involves a seawall? Oh, this is a well-informed group. Yeah, very good. So we have a great set of questions. There's one that really belongs in the next panel, and it will be central to the next panel. We have known for decades that we need to get off this train, but we haven't. What is missing? That's the next session. And that's going to be fun. For both of you, because this was raised, Isn't adaptation an excuse not to reduce the world's carbon emissions? That is a softball.
Happy to start that. It's been the argument for I don't know how long. And guess what? We've actually studied that. We've actually looked at whether or not talking about adaptation takes the motivation away from reducing the causes on the front end. And what we've found is that when people begin to look at how hard it is to adapt to climate change, they think mitigation is a bargain. It's a basement bargain deal. It is so much more complicated, so much more difficult, and I have only seen empirical evidence of people getting more interested in working on mitigation after they hear about how difficult it is to adapt.
Andrew?
There's plenty of money in the world to do both.
Well, that raises a question for you, and that's the adaptation development question, right? I've heard it argued that we shouldn't be focusing just on adaptation in the poor countries. We should encourage development so that they can afford to do it themselves. And trying to decide how you do that balance is complicated. Have you thoughts on that? Is that an illusory issue?
Well, it's a very live issue right now. In the mitigation side, there's been an amazing intellectual revolution over the last 10 years. We used to believe that doing something about climate change would be nice, but it's going to cost us in terms of jobs and growth. We then believed that actually it turns out you can do the two together. We now know that if you want to have jobs and growth, you have to act on mitigation. Incredible 3 phases we've gone through. The question is there an equivalent to that in adaptation? And we believe there is. So it's a mistake to think adaptation is over here and economic development is over here. Adaptation is absolutely the same thing as development. And the thing that we're really learning through our research and your research as well is that actually done right, adaptation can have all kinds of dynamic benefits. And we have to be careful here because we don't want to say, oh, climate change is good because then you have to adapt. But if you think about some things like, for example, drip irrigation. I mean, that was originally invented because of drought. Turns out, though, actually, drip irrigation has lots of other economic benefits. It uses less electricity and so on. So you actually can get lower costs for your food. It's actually cheaper. Think of the best adaptation policy in Africa. It'd be restoring the land. Restoring the lands are totally depleted. Why does that? So bring carbon down from the sky. Carbon up there is hurting people. Bring it down to earth in the form of soil and crops and trees and bushes. And you not only help solve the problem of climate change, you not only double yields for agriculture, but also those yields are more resilient, exactly what you're saying. In other words, we need to look for that sweet spot where you get that win-win. Now, not everything is win-win, by the way. Having to put electricity lines under the ground is just plain more expensive.
Yes.
Can I add one
Of course,
sentence to this?
of course.
I would love it if you walked out here today and threw out the noun adaptation and only from now on used the verb to adapt. What I mean by that is we have to simply adapt what we do. You will not be able to maintain whatever you do, whether it's development, economic development, or whatever you do in your day job, you will not be able to keep doing the same thing from here on for the rest of your life. You have to adapt what you do. And the question is, how do we do that? And how do we do that without adding to the problem of more emissions? How do we not create maladaptive, whatever interventions that we do? In other words, we make things worse. We have to think about how to solve multiple problems at once. One of your great MIT graduates, Beth Sawin, created an organization called Climate Interactive. And one of the things she does at her institution is she has really given teeth to a concept called MultiSolving, which is solving multiple problems at once. Most of these cities have already, whether it's electricity problems, drainage problems, whatever it is, right? How do they solve those problems in a way that is fit for purpose for a different kind of climate? That's the question. So throw out the noun, only adapt whatever you do.
and recognize that stationarity is over. You've drawn a couple of questions, Suzanne, and they relate to social justice. Does that complicate decision-making? Does it emphasis on social justice threaten political agreement? How does thinking about it change choices?
Well, you know, it depends on who you ask, whether it complicates matters. I mean, the fact that we are ignoring social justice and have ignored it for so long, and the fact that we have been, you know, pursuing racist policies, that's complicated life for a lot of people, right? So finally addressing them seems to only get to the heart of things for many people. So yes, for those of us who are in privileged places and you have no idea how to do that, certainly it complicates it. But again, coming back to this notion of solving more than one problem at once, you could actually make people better off solving their problems, creating jobs, and be more resilient, you know, emit less. I mean, those things are actually possible. So what we've learned in the adaptation community is when you bring them to the table, they actually might very well, people might change the framing of what it is that we're dealing with and begin to look for different types of solutions. It's not just an engineering fix, it's not just a finance fix, it is changing social relations and how people interact with each other and with their environment.
Let me ask you both kind of a broad question on policy. Since adaptation tends to be, to adapt.
Thank you.
tends to be very local. Boston has a plan. Providence may or may not. It's different. Worcester may or may not. Different countries face different issues. Different parts of the U.S. face different issues. What role is there? I know, Andrew, you've worked internationally. What role is there for, on the one hand, international efforts? It's not massive funding. And what role is there for federal efforts in the U.S.? It's because this is not a planning done in Washington activity, and it's not a planning done at the UN kind of activity. So very distinct from mitigation.
Well, I mean, there's no cause in the world that justifies foreign assistance more than this does. I mean, it's just morally the right thing to do. Absolutely right that plans should not be made in Washington or Boston for Zambia and Zimbabwe. One of the things that we're working on is that most adaptation money is spent at a sort of fairly centralized level, mainly at the federal government level in whatever government you are. Very little goes down to those who really, really need it, which is communities and villages and so on. And for a country like the United States that is very, very concerned about issues of corruption and so on, basically USAID wants its money to go to safe pairs of hands that, you know, can fill in the right forms and be audited. And fair enough. Plain fact of the matter is, we're going to have to take more risks here because the people that know the most are the people closest to the ground. Having said that, you know, your point about it's so specialized, it'll be different in every place. The same thing is one level true in health. It's true in, you know, as I was a young economist at the World Bank, every country you go to is, well, if you only understood our country, you know, your economics doesn't really apply here. Well, actually, there are some principles, and so too in this, like those 3 revolutions I talked about, the things that Suzanne was talking about, they apply everywhere, even though they have to be tailored to the local situation.
My former colleague, Rudy Dornbush, used to say that whenever he visited a country, they'd say, things are different here, but they never are.
Yeah, I think that's actually true, and I think we could use more mechanisms to learn. I mean, heaven forbid, in the United States, we ought to learn from developing countries. I tell you, we could learn so much about how scientists work with stakeholders on the ground, just as an example. I think to your question, 2 things I want to say. One is it depends on different roles. So a federal government has a very different set of muscle than what a local government has, right? So the muscle to produce climate projections that could be used, the downscaling, the investments, the rules and regulations, the standards they could help set, right? Those are the kinds of things that a federal government and higher institutions can be very useful for. Whereas at the local level, you might be able to do more experimentation, and then you have a field in which you share the learning and you exchange practices and you establish what is best practice. So there are, play to the strengths of the different levels to solve this problem. Quite frankly, we say it all the time that all adaptation is local. That's wrong. That's simply wrong. You will make no decision at the local level that does not have a federal regulation, a federal grant, a state regulation, or anything else involved. It's simply not true. All adaptation is multi-scalar, and we simply need to figure out how can we pass on what we're learning, the tools, and reduce the 10,000 rules to tools to something that actually works in most places, and share those lessons more quickly.
So here is an odd and interesting question, but I think will resonate with a fair number of people. The discussion so far is incredibly human-centric. What about the rest of the biosphere? What about other species? Is there work going? They don't adapt quickly necessarily.
Well, it depends, right?
It depends, yes.
Different species have different rates of adapting. Yes. But I think we ignore it at our peril. This morning I was, as I mentioned, at a conference that's about the Ecological Climate Action Network of Massachusetts. And they're very interested in the role of natural ecosystems, both helping them adapt, but also using natural ecosystems to help humans adapt. So there's a two-way street. And I think there are people who are focused on it. I think what people are realizing in that community is that if we ignore people, they don't get it. They don't necessarily care about it. They live in concrete and whatever. So they need to basically make the connection. But the integrated approach to this is probably the most promising. And I think we ignored at our peril not to look at the very life support system that we depend on.
I think it's a very good question. We don't know how many species there are out there. I think we've counted about 8 million of them.
Right.
We know that 1 million now are deeply threatened. And the year 2020 is a very, very important year, not only because the way the Paris deal was written is that every 5 years countries have to come back and increase their level of ambition. So the Conference of the Parties meeting next November, December in Glasgow is the most important meeting since Paris. So that's incredibly important. But in addition to that, there is the Biodiversity Conference of the Parties. Every 10 years, all the nations in the world get together and set targets for the next 10 years. And the targets for the 10 years we're leaving have been mainly failed. They're called the Aichi targets because it was based in Japan. China is hosting the Biodiversity Convention meetings, and it's very keen to get them right. So the two actually come together. In addition to that, there will be the most important UN meeting ever on the ocean, which will be in Portugal in June next year. And so you actually have these three very, very important, where real commitments need to be made. And exactly as you were saying, Suzanne, we need to think about them together. I mean, if we, because some species cannot adapt, just like we can't adapt fast enough. You asked a great question at the very beginning where you said, why can't we just adapt? Well, because, humans do adapt. History is about adapting. That's what history is. The problem is the changes are so rapid at the moment, we can't adapt fast enough. All of us here today, I'll bet, are here because at some stage in our family's history, we had to adapt to something dramatic. For me, my great-grandfather was a Scottish sheep farmer in the Outer Hebrides. And I know to the month when adaptation started for me, it was 1886, when the first refrigerated meat ship left New Zealand and Australia. And within 10 years, sheep farming was dead in the Outer Hebrides. Because of that, and because my great-great-grandfather had a family that was educated, moved to the mainland, within a generation, they were doing great, and I'm in this room today because we adapted. Now, the question is there an equally positive story we could tell about needing to adapt to climate change?
On that note, join me in thanking our two speakers.
Very nice to see you.